day 5 and session 6 of the Truth 2020 conference. If you've been here before, welcome back. If this is your first day, welcome to the conference. My name is Bob Barnard, and I'm professor of philosophy at the University of Mississippi, and I'm the moderator today. Since it is the last sort of day where we're doing sort of the hard work, the remaining session is sort of is an event that will allow us to hear about some other things going on, but not necessarily the presentation of research. I wanted to take a moment to thank everyone who gave their time and effort to making this meeting possible, all the speakers who gave their time and their effort, and my co-organizers as well. Over the last several days, we've had a really unique opportunity to catch up on what philosophical work on truth looks like in the year 2020. So thank you to everybody. I want to specifically recognize my co-organizers, Jody Latowski, Marcus Rosberg, Adam Podlaskowski, and Chase Wren for their efforts as well. And this is the point where we acknowledge the support of the University of Waikato in New Zealand and of the Future of Truth Project at the University of Connecticut. So if everybody's ready, we'll go ahead and we'll turn to the session. So one thing I've noticed over the last several meetings is one of the emerging themes that keeps coming up is the continuing relevance of Frank Ramsey's work. And so it's really nice that we're able to round out our scholarly program with a discussion of Cheryl Misak's excellent biography, Frank Ramsey, A Sheer Excess of Powers. So this is how the session will work. We'll start with an introduction to the work from Professor Misak. And then we'll take a 5-minute transition break. Then we'll hear from Professor Blackburn, and then another 5-minute transition break. Then Professor Hornsby will speak, offer her comments. Then we'll take a slightly longer break. And then Professor Misak will come back and be able to respond. And then we'll move to discussion and question and answer period as usual. And we'll sort of review how that works when we get there. One thing that's different today is rather than doing PowerPoint slides, the speakers have opted to do handouts. There is a link in the chat window to a tiny URL for today's session that has a combined documents with everybody's handouts there. So if you want to grab that and download those for reference, go ahead and do that now. Our first guest today is Professor Cheryl Misak. She's University Professor and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Toronto and author of this great new biography, Frank Ramsey, Sheer Excess of Powers. So let's turn it over to Professor Misak.
I'll give just a quick overview of the whole of Ramsey. So first off, let me say that this biography was a huge amount of fun to research and write. In a way, you think that philosophers ought not to have so much fun, but if any of you are interested in writing a kind of intellectual biography, I heartily recommend it. So as most of you probably know, Ramsey was a real superstar in at least 4 disciplines. Philosophy, economics, pure mathematics, subjective probability theory, and decision theory. In economics, he published only 2 papers, both in Keynes's economics journal. And when that journal had its 125th anniversary, they published their 13 greatest hits. And the editors had to explain in the introduction why they had 2 papers by one person in this very special volume. And those were Ramsey's 2 papers, and the editors explained that each paper really sparked a new branch of economics. So in economics, he is as big, if not bigger, than he is in philosophy. In pure mathematics, he has a branch of combinatorics named after him, Ramsey theory, that studies the conditions under which order must occur in the even large disordered states. And of course, he was the first person to figure out how to measure partial belief, come up with a subjective theory of probability, and put the wherewithal together for expected utility theory. In philosophy, which is what we're going to talk about today, we of course have Ramsey sentences, Ramsey conditionals, and many other things named after him. My favorite is Donald Davidson's The Ramsey Effect. Davidson said that the Ramsey effect is when you think you've lighted onto some absolutely brilliant idea, and then you realize that Frank Ramsey had that idea and expressed it more elegantly 70 years ago at the time. So it's pretty clear that that the reason that we haven't had a full intellectual biography up until now is that it's near impossible. Only Ramsey could really understand all of those very, very technical areas. And the way that I got around this almost insurmountable problem is that I had specialists write guest boxes. So, for instance, in Ramsey theory in mathematics, I had the greatest Ramsey theorist probably ever, Ron Graham, write a guest box. Unfortunately, Ron died a few weeks ago. In this guest box, he offers $1,000 US prize if someone can figure out some little bit of Ramsey theory. And I guess I'll have to commit myself to paying out if anyone can understand if someone actually gets that right. So lots of obstacles in writing this kind of biography. Also, Ramsey's style to talk about. Here's Roy Harrod, the great philosopher of statistics, talking about Ramsey's style. Harrod says, "The intellectual process is at white heat, but the style is delightfully cool, like that of some old naturalist taking one for a ramble in the country and making desultory observations." So Ramsey is famous for cutting corners, for skipping proofs, figuring out that we'll just keep up with him somehow. Add to all this that he died at the age of 26 in the middle of trying to get things right, especially about the topic that we're going to talk about today, about truth. If you look at the book manuscript that he was writing, which Jen is going to talk about, we have 3 drafts of 5 chapters in his manuscript remains. And the editors, Nick Rescher and Ulrich Meyer, suggest that Ramsey initially was going to write a book called Truth and Probability, the same title as his famous paper, Truth and Probability, but that he decided the project was too big and he split it into 2, one book on truth and one book on probability. I argue in the biography that I don't think that's right. We can only find one table of contents in his manuscripts, and that's the whole shooting match. He's going to talk about truth, he's going to talk about probability, general propositions, causation. He's going to talk about everything. And added to, another bit of evidence for that is that Ramsey's paper, Truth and Probability, in which he sets out subjective probability theory and shows how it has to be consistent with the axioms of probability theory. He read this to the Moral Sciences Club. Keynes was blown away by it, as was everyone else, and he never published it. So he read it in 1926, and he never published it, and that's because he was going to get it right in this big book. The drafts at Pittsburgh have all been jumbled in various transitions, so we don't know if one draft is older, one draft is, it's a mess. Same thing with the paper that Simon's going to discuss, his famous paper, Theories. It's gone missing. And we know that Richard Braithwaite, when he edited Ramsey's papers for posthumous publication, gave some of them titles, tinkered with them, and I suspect that that he did the same with that paper. It's very much a draft. Ramsey was writing a whole bunch of things about theories during the time. We don't know if it was 1929 or 1927. So we have all these really difficult kind of textual issues to resolve before we can really get Ramsey right. So I'm really thrilled that Simon and Jen are going to help do this, because they're two of the finest people thinking about Ramsey today. So with that said, we can get on with the main show.
Okay, well, I've got to start by saying that I think I'm here under false pretenses, because this was to be an author meets critic. And I'm not a critic of Cheryl's book. I think it's a marvelous book. I've seldom enjoyed reading such a book so much. I think it's beautifully paced for a biography, quite apart from, of course, the great philosophical interest which breathes off every page. So I could scarcely imagine myself raising a criticism of it. And when I was thinking what to say, I also couldn't really imagine myself raising many criticisms of Ramsey, because ever since I did my PhD, which was on the problem of induction of all things, that brought me into touch with Ramsey's work on probability, and I was immediately blown away, as was Keynes and many other people. And since then, I've been an avid fan of Ramsey's. When I turned my attention from the philosophy of science to thinking more about the philosophy of language, it wasn't long before I came across Ramsey's the so-called redundancy theory of truth. And although I was taken by that in early days, I'm looking back to the 1970s, it wasn't really until Paul Horwich's wonderful book on truth, another little gem of a book, came out, that I saw the full power of the deflationist or minimalist theories of truth, and became a convert to those two. So my own intellectual path, such as it is, has been really following, in Davidson's words, following the Ramsey effect, finding that ideas towards which I was struggling or tried to struggle had been eloquently expressed in these lapidary sentences of Ramsey's. And hence I'm not really flying under the flag of a critic of Ramsey's either. So what I thought I'd do instead was raise a problem which has intrigued me for some while. And this is partly biographical and partly philosophical. As people know, Ramsey's sentences are named after Ramsey. I'll explain what they are for anybody in the chat room who's not really up to speed on this. And the paper, which is usually, I think, supposed to be the fountain, the origin, is Theories, which is billed as having been written in 1929. Now, I gather from Cheryl's remarks just a few minutes ago that that's not by any means certain, and that may do something to explain the biographical or historical problem I had. I think it's much more likely, just on grounds which I'll try to develop, that it had the earlier date, that it may have been written as early as 1927, and that would explain something. It doesn't explain everything, but I'll come to that. Okay, so what is going on here? Well, I think in the background, we want to think of Bertrand Russell. Russell wrote The Analysis of Matter in 1927, and it's developed what subsequently, I think, became known as a kind of structural realism about the external world. Russell, of course, was a foundationalist. In those days, he was very much mining the same seams as Carnap. Carnap in the Aufbau started with remembered resemblances amongst private subjective experiences and hoped to construct a notion of the external world on that basis. Russell was doing more or less the same thing in The Analysis of Matter. And the reason it became known as a sort of structural realism was that Russell thought that all we could know about the external world and the things in the external world was their structure. That we couldn't know, as it were, what they are. The essence or identity escaped us. This, of course, goes back in some ways to very old ideas of Russell's, right from the time of the theory of descriptions and the distinction between knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. If you know things by description, then in Russell's view, you know their structure, their structural relations to each other, but you don't know necessarily what they are. So this overcomes, as it were, Locke's problem of how we can infer anything about the external world on the basis of our own experiences. It's an advance, Russell thought, on the more pure phenomenalism, the almost Berkeleyan phenomenalism that he'd advanced in knowledge of the external world in 1915. Okay, so that's the background. In 1928, a mathematician, Max Newman, who was a contemporary of Ramsey's at Trinity as an undergraduate, published a paper saying that Russell couldn't do what he claimed to have done. The structural descriptions that he was leaving himself with were simply too weak to bear the weight of being described as structural theories. They didn't really have a determinate structure. They didn't have a determinate, as it were, mathematical existence. To try and explain how this goes, I think I'd like to use a toy example. I hope the experts in the room will forgive me, but there may be people who need a bit of explanation. Suppose I have some data about something. So I'm going to take the example of I was watching a documentary series, which has just been shown on British television, about the dreadful life of Rupert Murdoch. Not dreadful in the sense it was dreadful for Murdoch, dreadful in the sense it was dreadful for everyone else. So suppose I've got a lot of data about what Murdoch's up to, how he picks up politicians, suborns them, then drops them, so on, changes his allegiances. And I want to imagine two theories. It's very difficult to make a determinate guess about his psychology. So I imagine two theorists. One says, Rupert wants to promote a right-wing agenda. To do this, he wants power. And to get the power, he needs money, right? Three elements there. The determinate a desire to promote a right-wing agenda, the desire for power, the desire for money. Somebody else says, Rupert wants to form a dynasty, cares deeply about his children. He wants to form a dynasty, and to do this, he wants money, and to get the money, he wants power. So you've got the same three, well, you've got different three elements, but the same structure. And the structure can be identified by going quantificational. The structure those two different explanations share is in each case of the form, there's an X, a Y, and a Z, where X and Y and Z are mental states. Rupert has X, and Rupert has Y, and Rupert has Z. And because RZ, Rupert has Z, we are Y, and because RY, RX. The third explains the second, and the second explains the first, the ordering I gave them. Okay, and that quantificational structure, you might think is something that is common to both those explanations, and it's done without the mention of the particular mental states. Now, of course, in itself, it's very much weaker than either of the two psychological theories which were advanced to explain Rupert's doings. But that weakness for Russell was, in a sense, its strength, because the idea was that that would give us the nugget, the bit we know about the external world, even if we don't know about the constitution of its elements. So you get a pure quantificational sentence with the theoretical terms substituted by quantifiers. There's an X, there's a Y, there's Z, Rupert has X, Rupert has Y, Rupert has Z, because our Z are Y, and because our Y are X. If you don't like because, you think that causation's a bit iffy, perhaps on Humean grounds or something, you can put in another quantifier. There's another relation that Rupert's possession of X bears to his possession of Y, and his possession of Z bears to his possession of, and so on. So you can continue that process of eliminating direct mention of theoretical entities or theoretical properties or theoretical relations until you're left with a pure sentence of formal logic, a sentence either of first or second order quantification theory. And that's called Ramsification. That's producing the Ramsey sentence of a theory. Max Newman, pointed out in a beautiful little paper, strongly recommended if you haven't read it, in Mind in 1928, that Russell's gone too far. You go too far if you go as far as these pure quantification sentences, because you're left with sentences which, if they're consistent, will have a model in any domain of sufficient cardinality. The rider that they've got to be of sufficient cardinality, as any of you who've done first order logic will know, is there because you can have asymmetric relations which are described as asymmetric. You need two things to be related by them, and so on. You can have first order sentences which insist that a domain has 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, anything up to a denumerable infinity of elements. And this is well known in model theory. So basically, Newman pointed out that, I've got a quote from Newman here, any collection of things can be organized so as to have the structure W, this is just the structure, provided they're the right number of them. Hence the doctrine that only structure is known involves the doctrine that nothing can be known that is not logically deducible from the mere fact of existence, except, theoretically, the number of constituent objects. A couple of critics, not critics, oh, we've lost Cheryl. A couple of commentators on this said, well, Newman's problem can be put this way. Russell wishes to turn theoretical terms into variables by Ramsification. It's interesting that Dimopoulos and Michael Friedman just say by Ramsification. You know, we all know what it is to substitute quantificational quantifiers for proper names or mentions of proper relations. Accordingly, physics becomes the assertion that there exist properties and relations having certain logical features. The problem is that this procedure trivializes physics. It threatens to turn the empirical claims of science into mere mathematical truths. Russell wasn't actually talking about physics so much as knowledge of the external world, but still the point applies. And in fact, in theories, Ramsey isn't talking about sense data and the external world. He's just talking about what he calls the primary system, which is the system which gives you your data about which you're theorizing. More precisely, if our theory is consistent and if all its purely observational consequences are true, then the truth of the Ramsey sentence follows as a theorem of set theory or second order logic, provided our initial domain has the right cardinality. And if it doesn't, then the consistency of our theory again implies the existence of the domain that does. Okay, so there we are. That's the, sorry, I'm just trying to look at my notes. That's the Newman's objection to Russell. Now, if Ramsey had been writing in 1929, it would seem to me, as a matter of biography, very strange that he didn't mention Newman's paper. Newman, as I say, was a friend of his, a colleague, close friend and colleague. They went on holidays together, I think. And of course, Ramsey was also very much, in a sense, involved with Bertrand Russell. That is, Russell had been a very important influence on Ramsey's development. Principia Mathematica formed a kind of bedrock of his logic. So the fact that one friend of Ramsey's was publishing, and uniquely for him, Newman never published another paper in philosophy. He published extensively in topology, and he was a great pioneer of computing. He developed the first, one of the very first digital computers in Manchester after the Second World War, and he was a mentor of Alan Turing's. So he had plenty of irons in the fire, but not many philosophical irons in the fire, and this was one of the only ones of them. It seemed to me almost inconceivable that he wouldn't have, as it were, pushed his work across Ramsey's desk. And then it would be almost inconceivable that Ramsey went on to develop the idea of substituting quantifiers for theoretical terms without at least doffing his cap, not only in the direction of Newman, but in the direction of Russell, because Russell had been, as it were, pioneering this technique from possibly as early as 1919, because when Russell read Newman's paper in 1928, he immediately, the same year, I mean, just a month's delay perhaps, Newman gave Russell a copy of the paper, I believe. I don't think Russell had to wait for it to come out in mind. Russell immediately said, "Oh my God, that's obvious. Why didn't I think of that?" And as I think Mark Champagne points out in a paper on this issue, Russell had thought of it, because he makes a very similar structure, a point about mere structure in Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, which had been published in 1919, written during the First World War. So it seems that Russell probably had a slip of memory. He'd just forgotten that he'd done it. But of course, it was obvious to him once it was pointed out. And it would have been obvious to Ramsey as well once it was pointed out. It's not, as it were, I mean, I am no logician, but it's not logic that lies beyond my ken entirely. So if it's obvious to me, it's obvious to Russell and Ramsey and Newman. When Russell said, "Oh yes, thanks for pointing that out, it's obvious," it's surprising, I think, that he didn't immediately effect a repair. He suggests a direction in which he might effect a repair, still preoccupied with the problem of our sense experience in the external world. He thinks that if we introduce some kind of temporal relations between objects in the external world and sense experiences for which they're responsible, that we can get a sort of something more than a mere structural handle on the nature of the external world. We can do more, as it were, to cross Locke's gap. And that's all very well, but of course, as Russell knew, it would require development, and I don't think he ever returned to it. So he can't be said to have escaped from Newman's problem, although he did sketch directions in which an escape might take place. Well, as I say, my historical problem or biographical problem about Ramsey's treatment of all this was why he was silent in theories about this development, the development which, as we say, might have started, could be said to have been started in 1919, the Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, a book which Ramsey must have known, and which then, provoked this 1928 exchange between Newman and Russell. So that was my biographical conundrum, which I am presenting to Cheryl. The answer to it may well be that Ramsey wrote theories before 1928. That may do something to explain his silence, but it still raises a little bit of a puzzle, because certainly by the time I came to edit it, the backlog of publication for Mind was years. If you submitted a paper to Mind in the 1950s when Ryle was editor, or still later before I became editor, you'd wait 2 or 3 years for publication. And again, if Newman, who was a good friend of Ramsey's, was thinking about this, he might have been thinking about it as early as 1925, let's say, or 26. I don't know the publication lag of the journal Mind under Moore's editorship. But again, if Moore had received the paper as editor in 1926, let's say, or 1925, it would seem to be very unlikely that he'd not have gone to Ramsey to ask for a commentary on it. Moore was no mathematician, and there was no developed system of refereeing in those days. So the obvious thing for Moore to have done would have been to pick up the telephone and ask the best mathematician he knew whether this stuff of Newman's was any good or not. So again, it's surprising that it hadn't crossed Ramsey's desk. So that's the biographical problem. I don't think it leaves a philosophical problem, except that one might ask then why Ramsey's developing this process of quantification in the belief that it's of some value in identifying the real content of theories. Why did Ramsey pursue this structural enterprise, knowing, or at least well able to see, that it was likely to lead to a dead end, to just pure theorems of the calculus, or quasi-theorems that have a model in any domain of the right cardinality, which couldn't be said to give, even in a sort of bare way, the structure of any worthwhile scientific theory. I think the answer to that conundrum, the conundrum of why Ramsey thought this worth pursuing, lies in the very, very different projects that he ever had in his life, and that people like Russell and Carnap had. Russell and Carnap were foundationalists. They were empiricists. They were interested in the relationship between sense experience and the external world, and they conceived of the matter in terms of foundations and buildings. Ramsey had been influenced, as Cheryl shows in her book, by Peirce. And Peirce, of course, was not a foundationalist. I quote Peirce in the notes that you've got. I think Peirce saying that for Peirce, we always start in medias res, and the saying of Peirce, which Ramsey apparently copied from him, was, "Let us not pretend to doubt in philosophy what we do not doubt in our hearts." Now, when you come to experience in the external world, of course, the foundationist project of Russell and Carnap does ask you to doubt what you know in your hearts, to ask you to concentrate purely on your own internal experience, if you can do that, and forget about the chairs and tables in an enterprise of trying to build them up from the materials you've got to hand. And that's a foundational project, and it's not a project which would be of any interest to Peirce. For Peirce, you start in medias res, you start in the middle of things, and there is no point in stripping away in a Cartesian fashion things that you know perfectly well in a project of pursuing a foundational structure. If Ramsey was following Peirce's motto, Peirce's advice, then of course he wouldn't be in the business of exorcising all theoretical terms from all observations. You could draw, for example, in your theory of Rupert Murdoch's psychology, on an awful lot you know about notions like wanting power, wanting money, wanting a dynasty. You don't have to strip those away and leave bare quantifiers with very, very thin structural relations to hold them together. So, so it seems to me possible that the reason Ramsey wasn't bothered by Newman's paper was that he wasn't interested in anything remotely like a project, a foundational project of relating theory to the primary system, as he calls it. He would have been perfectly happy with seeing us as starting with an amalgam of theory and observation. I don't think there's any, I don't know of any text in which he talks explicitly about the observation theory distinction. Cheryl may be able to enlighten us about that, and I hope she can. But it seems to me likely, and this is my philosophical suggestion, that Ramsey, because he's not interested in a foundational project, felt that such stripping off as he was interested in of reference from theoretical terms would leave far more than the bare structures exhibited by quantification theory, theorems or formulae of quantificational theory. There'd be far more chunky relations and far more chunky things to say about theoretical entities at any point at which you're theorizing. You're not going to be introducing orphan terms, terms which come into the world without any liaisons with any family, which are orphaned, as it were, from the word go and just sit on the page as pure constants in an uninterpreted calculus. That's never the situation we're actually in. It would have been foreign to Peirce, and I think it would have been foreign to Ramsey. That, of course, raises the question about what he's up to in theories. And I confess that although I've read it recently, several times, I find it's even more condensed and more indirect than much of his writing. And I think it is something of a sketch, notes for future development, rather than a finished paper which he'd have been pleased to see in print. And again, I put that down as just a suspicion. My final question isn't biographical or philosophical, but it is historical. It's to do with the history of philosophy, which is why are Ramsey sentences called Ramsey sentences? I mean, I'm the last one, especially in this company, to deny Ramsey any scintilla of his, huge reputation. But it seems to me that the device that is familiarly called a Ramsey sentence, or the Ramsification of a theory, was actually quite common quite a while before Ramsey was writing. As I say, it's there in Russell. I think Demopoulos and Friedman mention it as being there in Schlick, who was writing in a similar vein in the 19 teens, between 1915 and 1917. It's there in Carnap, and in a sense it's a device which was, as it were, common currency by the 1920s, when Ramsey would first have been involved with it, which raises a question of historical moment or historical interest. So I don't know who the first, Cheryl may be able again to tell us about this, I'm sure she can, who the first who was the first person to attribute the process of quantification to Ramsey, and to think of Ramsey as having, as it were, advanced it as an important tool in the understanding of the relationships between data and theory. And so that's a question, a historical question, which I'd like to leave this forum with. And that completes the remarks I wanted to make. I'd like to have talked about probability and truth. I'd like to mention one thing, which is that although Ramsey's name became associated with the idea of subjective probability, I think he would have hated, in fact, I'm sure he would have hated that title, because there's nothing subjective about the way in which we come up with theories of probability. They become part of the system with which we meet the future. And such systems can be better or worse. They're subject to objective control. Famously, some estimates of chance go into physics textbooks, like half-lives and so forth in quantum mechanics. And the idea that by starting with confidence, degrees of credence, confidence, and utilities, you finish with anything purely subjective. I mean, that would have been, I think, as foreign to Ramsey as it is to me. So I think that we shouldn't go on allowing that theory to be called subjective probability theory. Thank you very much. Sorry not to have been a useful critic, but I hope I raised some interesting issues.
Our next speaker is Jen Hornsby, who's Professor of Philosophy at Birkbeck College, University of London, and Emeritus Fellow of Corpus Christi College, Oxford.
If you got the handout with quotations, then you'll know that I think Cheryl's biography of Ramsey is truly excellent. Indeed, if I may say so, I think it's even better than Simon thinks it is. And like Simon, I hadn't really appreciated that this session of author and critics was part of a very large conference on truth. When I accepted it, I snapped at the invitation, talk about a wonderful truth book of which I'm a critic but have no criticisms. So when Cheryl says that I'm one of these thinkers about Ramsey, that really isn't quite right. I mean, I've only very recently started thinking about Ramsey on truth. And I'm disappointed in a way to learn something that Bob said at the beginning of the session, that there's been all sorts of talk about Ramsey in the course of the conference. And that's because I haven't been able to attend any other sessions, and I prepared my paper as if people need to know what Ramsey thought about truth. And I'm going to tell you, as it were. So it probably won't connect with such issues as may have arisen. Anyway, if you've seen that handout, you'll know that my paper comes in 3 sections, and I'm going to start. On Truth came into print in 1991, and that was more than 60 years after Ramsey's death. It was assembled from drafts which Ramsey wrote in the last couple of years of his short life, and we've only got the beginning of a project which Ramsey never completed. Some there are who think that Ramsey hit upon a wholly new view of truth when he wrote this material. Cheryl disagrees with them, and so do I. Cheryl starts the story of Ramsey on truth with a paper which Ramsey gave as a talk in 1921 when he was 18 years old. And like the incomplete book, this wasn't published until long after his death. It's called The Nature of Propositions. And what Cheryl says about it is this: Ramsey started to dimly discern a positive proposal which he would continue to develop the whole of his life. The hint of this positive proposal comes right at the end of this paper, when Ramsey turns very briefly to the idea of truth, and he wrote, quotation on the handout, "The most certain thing about truth is that P is true and P, if not identical, are equivalent. This enables us to rule out at once some theories of truth, such as that to be true means to work or to cohere, since clearly P works and P coheres are not equivalent to P. Unsurprisingly, Ramsey never takes it back that P is true and P are equivalent. Who could deny it? But there's more to be said, and this is now the development of which Cheryl speaks, which can be found both in the published Aristotelian Society paper, Facts and Propositions, and in On Truth, the unfinished book. In On Truth, Ramsey is quite explicit that in order to speak about the nature of truth, one needs not only to recognize the equivalence of P as true and P, but also to attend to the concepts of belief and assertion. As Cheryl puts it, quoting from her, and it's on the handout, these concepts, belief and assertion, do all the heavy lifting for the concept of truth. And in that heavy lifting, pragmatism does some work as well. Let me begin with the naive correspondence theory of truth, which Ramsey very certainly denied. It faces an objection made by Russell to a theory Russell abandoned in favour of his multiple relation theory of judgment. Russell may or may not have held exactly the view that I'm attributing him by making him a naive correspondentist, but what matters is the objection. So the naive correspondence theorist says, one who judges that P judges a proposition, and her judgment is true if and only if the proposition corresponds to a fact. And the difficulty for such a theory, which Russell appreciated, is that it requires us to posit objective falsehoods, subsisting independently of any minds. One who judges that P judges a proposition, which is an objective fact, if she judges truly. But when we turn to someone who judges falsely, we encounter what's sometimes called the problem of false propositions. Russell said, Othello, when he believes that Desdemona loves Cassio, cannot have before his mind a single object. Well, truths are of the same kind as falsehoods. Alike, truths and falsehoods are propositions. False beliefs very evidently aren't single objects, nor then can there be anything that they are. If you believe that they're objective falsehoods, then you might as well believe that there are such Meinongian monstrosities as round squares or the indefinite man. I think one should see the naive correspondence theorist's difficulties as owed to their reification of propositions, to their speaking of propositions as if they might, for all the world, be objects, items in the domain of first-order quantification. Things which are believed and asserted, and which may be true or may be false, are objects in that sense. According to the correspondence theorist, Ramsey, in accounting for truth, must be seen as denying just this. Here's Ramsey, according to philosophers who believe in them, it's propositions which are true or false, a belief being called true or false by an extension of meaning, according to what's believed is true or false of a proposition. But the existence of such things as these propositions is generally, and to my mind rightly, doubted. So Ramsey hoped to account for truth as it may be predicated of such things as may be taken to be true or false, when the existence of propositions is not allowed. Truth and falsehood are attributed primarily of thoughts and opinions, Ramsey said. Truth and falsehood can be attributed derivatively to sentences, the truth or falsehood of sentences, depending on what people mean by them, which is to say, the thought or opinions that they use to express. Well, truth bearers have a characteristic which Ramsey calls propositional reference. I'm going to substitute propositional content for propositional reference, thinking that Ramsey's vocabulary is mismatched to the one which we're nowadays familiar with. So an analysis of propositional content is needed in an account of truth. Again, a quotation from Ramsey, an account of truth which accepts the notion of propositional content without analysis cannot possibly be regarded as complete. For all the many difficulties connected with that notion, are really involved in truth, which depends on it. So we must distinguish the account of truth which Ramsey would wish to complete from what he presents as a definition of truth. When he presents his definition, Ramsey isolates beliefs as the truth bearers, and he says, a belief is true if it's a belief that P and P, but false if it's a belief that P and not P. I should say Ramsey notices that the word not has to introduce a species of negation with which false can be interdefinable, and he planned a chapter on negation, which he never wrote, and no doubt he'd have sorted this out. So how should one think of such things as belonging in the category into which Ramsey takes beliefs, judgments, and indicative sentences to fall? Well, one such thing is something we might come to know that Cheryl believes when Simon tells us that Cheryl believes that Bob is the moderator. According to the naive correspondence theorists whom I've set Ramsey against, in telling us this, Simon makes use of a singular term, that Bob is the moderator, which makes reference to something to which Cheryl stands in the belief relation. Not so, according to Ramsey. Simon asserts the sentence Bob is a moderator, informing us of something Cheryl believes, and now we know a way Cheryl takes things to be, assuming only that Simon got it right, as he did. Of course, even Cheryl might sometimes have a false belief. Then she would take things not to be a way that they are, but a way that they aren't. Ramsey doesn't speak of ways things are, still less of ways things aren't. But if ways things are is allowed to do work of the sort I'm putting it to, then false beliefs are simply accommodated. Ramsey said a belief's false if it's a belief that P and not P. I say that if P says how things are, then not P says how things aren't. Ramsey considers two men who believe the same thing. Their beliefs have the same propositional content, or as I'm putting it, there's some way or other that both men take things to be. And if I speak of a way things are, which can go hand in hand with the way things aren't, that's only in order to have something general to say about beliefs, despite the fact that there are many forms that a belief may take. This, I think, can help in conveying what's required for what someone believes or says to be true, without making use of an idea of a proposition conceived as something distinct from a sentence, from something that is said, as sentences are in Ramsey's view. So perhaps one can now take further something Ramsey claimed. Any belief whatever we may symbolize as a belief that P, where P is a variable sentence. Using sentence variables, we can quantify over sentences, and echoing Ramsey's definition, we can say what it is for a person to believe something true. Thus, and then this is me, as it were, no longer a quotation. X has a true belief if and only if there is a P, X believes that P and P. And if we're prepared to use my gloss, then we could put this by saying that X believes something true if and only if there's a way X believes things to be, and so they are. The gloss I'm using has something. It's crucial here that the quantifier is second order. And herein resides the crucial difference from the naive correspondence theorist, who, when she says that there's something X believes and which is true, makes use of a first order quantifier. Well, so far I've meant only to give a friendly and no doubt simplistic exposition of Ramsey. Of course, my exposition takes us no way towards Ramsey's ambition of analysing propositional content, upon which he said truth depends. Well, I'll come to the matter of analysing propositional content when I look at the prospects for pragmatism, but I want first to say something more about correspondence. That's to say something more, if you like, against it. I began by saying how much I agree with Cheryl when she said that already in the talk Ramsey gave in 1921 when he was 18 years old, he discerned a proposal which he would develop. I quoted a bit of Ramsey that Cheryl had quoted, and I want now to draw attention to a couple of other things that Ramsey said back in 1921. He said that so-called propositional phrases, we're apt to say that clauses, don't stand for propositions in the usual sense, since there are no such things as propositions in the usual sense. He also said that there was no reason to suppose that there are facts. He argued that those who appeal to facts suppose that they're implied by our language, which bit of language, however, he said, had a completely adequate analysis without presuming the existence of facts. So Ramsey believed that there are no propositions and that there are no facts. How unlikely it must be that he held a theory of truth saying that propositions correspond to facts, and how plausible it is that he wanted truths simply to be facts, if you're prepared to use the notion of fact in a way at odds with how it was being used when Ramsey said there are no facts. Well, I find that a notion of correspondence comes readily to people's minds when they raise questions about truth. For instance, I've often heard it said that Aristotle held a correspondence theory of truth. But to me, it's utterly mysterious how a notion of corresponding might be injected into what Aristotle said. Somewhat less of a mystery, however, is why Ramsey might be thought to hold some version of a correspondence theory of truth. In a manuscript printed as an appendix, which his editors say treats matters discussed in the second half of chapter 1 of On Truth, Ramsey wrote, "Of the three leading types of theories, the correspondence theory, the coherence theory, and pragmatism, only the first engages with us on the main issue, and our view belongs undoubtedly to the class of correspondence theories." It could seem that Ramsey thought that there were various theories in the class of correspondence theories, of which what I've called a naive correspondence theory was just one. Well, I don't myself know quite what might be claimed by a more sophisticated theory worthy of the name correspondence theory. So my guess has to be that Ramsey set out thinking that his theory had to be slotted into one of the three main theories of truth that were regarded in contention, and he couldn't put it under either of the other categories. At any rate, Ramsey is quick to say that even if we were to take a belief as being true to there being a matter of fact to which the belief corresponds, we wouldn't know what was that meant by that until we had a theory of propositional content. And indeed, only a page or two later, Ramsey says, and this is something Cheryl now quotes, and helpfully I think, "This talk of correspondence, though legitimate and convenient for some purposes, gives, in my opinion, not an analysis of truth, but a cumbrous periphrasis, which it's misleading to take for an analysis. To believe truly is to believe that P went P, and there's really no need to recast this definition in terms of correspondence. Talk of correspondence, then, has no place in any straightforward statement of Ramsey's account of truth." Well, that's good by me, but there's a problem. Ramsey can appear to have been inconsistent, for at one point he says, quotation on the handout, "I do not therefore see how it can be denied that when we say that other people's opinions are true or false, we mean that they do or do not correspond to the facts." Well, myself, I think Ramsey must deny that which he doesn't see how it can be denied. And I want to explore this further. This will enable me to persist in my opinion that Ramsey was firmly opposed to anything that might be labelled a correspondence theory of truth. And I hope it may also serve to bring out what I take such opposition to correspondence theories actually to amount to consist in. Could Ramsey really think that we're obliged to indulge in what he considers a bit of cumbrous periphrasis if we want to say what's meant by someone who says that someone else's opinions are true or are false? For my own part, I think when I say that X's opinions are true, I mean no more than what I actually say. If someone were to tell me that what I really mean is that X's opinions correspond to the facts, then I should think that they did worse than engage in needless circumlocution. I should fault them for being in the sway of the correspondence theory of truth. So how did Ramsey reach the conclusion that we mean others' opinions do or do not correspond to the facts when we say that they're true or false? So next on the handout is Ramsey's premise, that which leads to his inserting therefore. When he says therefore, it can't be denied that. If A says B's opinion agrees with the fact, the relation he assumes to hold is one between B's opinion and the fact, not between his own opinions about them. And that makes it seem as if A's own opinions could just be left out of the matter in a case in which A says B's opinions agree with the fact. If A's opinions were neither here nor there, then when A says B's opinions agree with the fact, the only idea A could have of B's opinion agreeing with the fact would be a matter of B's opinion standing in relation to it, a relation which Ramsey calls correspondence. But a person does not detach herself either from her own or from B's, some other person's opinions, in determining whether she takes B's opinions to be true. If A says B's opinion agrees with the fact, she can only mean that she agrees with B. With A and B seen as in agreement, there's just one thing judged, and it's judged by them both. There couldn't then be any need for A to think that there was some further thing corresponding to that which B thinks. So what lands Ramsey in trouble, I think, in the short passage in which he says that it can't be denied that we have to speak of correspondence in certain circumstances, is the claim about what we mean when we say that other people's opinions are true or false. It's now as if our opinions might be left out of the matter when we speak of other people's thinking. But we cannot speak from outside our own thinking. If someone thinks that P, then her question, whether other people's opinions are true, reduces to the question whether she agrees with these other people. And then it cannot be right to take the question whether other people's opinions are true as a question about whether their opinions match up to facts, where facts are conceived as elements of external reality by which opinions are to be measured. That Ramsey himself thought that there's no need to contemplate a reality external to thought is clear in his 1927 paper, Facts and Propositions, where he says, "It is perhaps obvious that if we have analysed judgment, we have solved the problem of truth." Given that he was writing a book on truth, Ramsey's position can't have been that there is no problem with truth. But that problem of truth, he thought, is the problem of judgment, a problem if soluble to be solved with an analysis of propositional content. And then it's not only the vocabulary of a correspondence theorist which is to be avoided. One must be clear that to consider true another's opinion as much as one's own, there can be no call to posit a reality external to thought. What one believes, if one believes truly, is a fact, not something that corresponds to something else. I'm making heavy weather of this, but I'm trying to draw out what I think is, if you like, special to Ramsey. My claim then is that Ramsey suffered a momentary aberration when he suggested that a relation of correspondence needs to be introduced in understanding how others' opinions might be true. At the end of the day, Ramsey surely is on my side in this matter. He wrote, and now a slightly longer quotation on the handout, "The fact is that we cannot claim truth for our judgments when making them, for if we did, our judgment would be about itself, which is impossible. It's a fundamental mistake to suppose that in our thinking, except when we're thinking about thought, we use the idea of truth at all. We do not set up truth as a standard and ask ourselves, are my thoughts about the earth true? Do they correspond to the fact? We ask simply, what is what? For instance, is the earth flat? And when we try to find out whether the earth is flat, the nature of truth is irrelevant, for we're concerned with the nature of truth, not with that of the nature of the earth, when we ask whether the earth is flat, not with that of our thought. Indeed, if one needs to determine whether P, one may engage in reasoning or one may need to investigate. But then one's question is not what is true, what should I add to the stock of my beliefs? As one might put this, there can be no question but that one does at any time agree with oneself. In order to believe another person who tells one something, one must believe that that person herself believes what she says. But one cannot believe oneself. And that, I think, is what Ramsey says is impossible, or goes hand in hand with what Ramsey explicitly says is impossible. So I come to what's section 3 in my talk. In 1921, Ramsey rejects the idea that to be true is to work, and I assume that's what he then thought pragmatists think. And he rejects the idea that to be true is to cohere, as the idealists of his time, for whom he had little sympathy, certainly thought. And he rejects these on the grounds that they fall foul of recognizing the equivalence of P and P is true. He doesn't mention corresponds in 1921. But I've argued he really does come to rule it out. And that means that if one is to have a Ramseyan account of truth, of one of what Ramsey called the 3 leading types, correspondence, coherence, pragmatism, it looks as though one's got to find a better version of pragmatism than one which equates is true with works. And since a complete account of truth must have an account of propositional content, what will be needed is a pragmatic account of propositional content. As Cheryl put it, pragmatism must do some of the heavy lifting. Well, myself, I think this heavy lifting is not to be done, despite the best efforts of some philosophers who have attempted to do it. It would take me a very long time to tell you why I think this heavy lifting can't be done, why the project of providing an account of propositional content in Ramsey's sense is doomed. So rather than try to spell it all out, I'll just make some points that I can connect with 3 of the guest boxes. Cheryl explained that she had experts write about certain matters, and I've picked on guest boxes from all of Ian Rumfitt, Simon Blackburn, and Hugh Price, in order to just say some more about why I think the project really can't be completed. And I should say I'm not actually going to disagree with them. I'm going to make use of what these 3 philosophers say in their guest boxes. But I want to start at the beginning of the project. Those who've tried to find an account of content suited to Ramsey's project suppose that as a good pragmatist, Ramsey will wish to account for belief in terms of action. And they all start with what Ramsey said about chickens, long quotation on the handout. The nature of mental factors in a belief will depend on the sense in which we're using the ambiguous term belief. It is, for instance, possible to say that a chicken believes a certain sort of caterpillar to be poisonous, and mean by that merely that it abstains from eating such caterpillars on account of unpleasant experiences connected with them. The mental factors in such a belief would be parts of the chicken's behaviour, which are somehow related to the objective factors, namely the kind of caterpillars and poisonousness. An exact analysis of this relation would be very difficult, but it might well be held that in regard to this kind of belief, the pragmatist view was correct, i.e. that the relation between the chicken's behaviour and the objective factors was that the actions were such as to be useful if and only if the caterpillars were actually poisonous. I guess that many of us will think that chickens aren't in any sense believers, but even if we deny that chickens have beliefs, we must surely have some notion of cognition in application to them. Chickens, like other animals, have capacities to take in information through sense organs and to move themselves around. The sensory input and behavioural output then being mediated by desires, including, for instance, desires to avoid painful things or ingesting poisonous substances. And I think I've deliberately said a bit about chickens because I think it's useful to think about the situation of an animal in its world, as it were. Now, in this case, not a human world. Well, Ramsey saw that the sense of belief, if chickens and other non-human animals have beliefs, can't be the exclusive concern of a philosopher who takes assertions and sentences to be candidates for truth and falsity. Chickens being languageless, Ramsey thinks that their behaviours can be set aside for his purposes, and he wrote, without wishing to depreciate the importance of this kind of belief, which I've tried to say we shouldn't depreciate in giving my little account of an animal's life in its environment, without wishing to depreciate the importance of this kind of the chicken's belief, it is not what I wish to discuss here. I prefer to deal with those beliefs which are expressed in words, or possibly images or other symbols, consciously asserted or denied. Well, this brings me straight to Ian Rumfitt's text box. Rumfitt says, an assertion's content derives from the belief that it would express if sincere. So when it's allowed that beliefs are expressed in words, it becomes evident that one can't account for belief in terms simply of action. One's just presupposing stuff about the use of language in communication. And of course, we talk about many things which we never have an opportunity to use or to change or in any way to act with or through. Rumfitt makes another point. In thinking of the belief's contents as to be explicated in terms of the actions they would cause, one focuses on what lies downstream from a belief. The focus can't be there exclusively, Rumfitt evidently thinks. Even the chicken's behaviour is intelligible, only if it recognises the caterpillar it avoids to be of a poisonous sort, presumably having certain markings. So we've got to have, we've got to attribute vision, sight, to the chicken. We might even want to think about how the chicken will behave even as it turns away from the caterpillar. Its movements will still be guided by information it takes in as to how the land lies around here. So it looks as though an account of how a creature's cognitions connect with their actions can't be freed from the account of that creature's sensory organisms being at work. In the case of human beings, we'll be happy, presumably, to speak of cognitions as beliefs and of sensory organs as being at work. That is to describe perceiving in a certain way. But if an account of belief can't be freed from an account of perception, nor can it be freed from an account of desire. And this brings me to Simon's guest box, where he talks of the holism of the mental. When Davidson first spoke of such, Donald Davidson, I think, first sort of insisted on the holism of the mental, he was concerned about the interdependencies of beliefs and desires and how such interdependencies ramify. One can't stay still in working out what someone will do on the strength of their beliefs and desires. Well, that means that desire can't simply be left out of the matter if a belief is to be treated, as Ramsey seems to have wanted it to be treated, simply as a disposition to act. So, question, can Ramsey bring desires into account. Very many philosophers nowadays are happy to talk about beliefs and desires combining to cause actions. And they assume that beliefs and desires alike have what they will call propositional content. Sometimes they're both said to be propositional attitudes. But as it seems to me, desires have a different sort of content from beliefs. And I actually think Ramsey might have agreed with me. He spoke specifically of indicative sentences when he asked what sorts of things are true at the very beginning of On Truth. And as it seems to me, and might have seemed to Ramsey, desires, which may be satisfied or unsatisfied rather than true or false, are not expressed with indicative sentences. One believes that things are a certain way, but one desires that they be some way. And here one doesn't have an indicative sentence. One finds a subjunctive. So I won't go on about the non-propositionality of desire and intention, but that's what I'm invoking now in finding just one other reason why the pragmatist project on Ramsey's behalf isn't going to work. So I hope that the prospects for a pragmatism which completes Ramsey's account of truth are coming to seem dim. But there's a further difficulty for it, which crops up when one reads Hugh Price's guest box, which is called Ramsey's Pragmatism about Causation and Time. Price notes that Ramsey said that from the situation we are deliberating about seems to me to arise the general difference of cause and effect. Yeah, maybe. But is the idea of causality that then arises one of which Ramsey makes any use? I mean, he believes in it, but I don't think he ever imports it into his accounts. Price mentions Nancy Cartwright as a causal realist, thereby finding a link between causation and agency, a link which Ramsey's pragmatism must surely make. Well, I'm a big fan of Cartwright on questions about causation, but as far as I know, she never addresses the question, what is it for a person to act intentionally, or for a chicken or any other animal to behave purposively? And even if Cartwright could make Ramsey a present of some idea of causality which his pragmatism needs, I think it would be mismatched the only idea of causation which Ramsey himself ever explicitly invokes. Ramsey speaks of causes and effects, taking causes and effects alike to be events. He makes use then of the idea of causation, which belongs in the so-called belief-desire theory of action, which I've already contested to some extent. And to find out what Ramsey thought events are, one needs to look to his chapter in On Truth on events and time. It's chapter 5, I think the last one that he got to the end of. One discovers there that Ramsey held a view of time incompatible with the fact, as I myself take it to be, that time passes. Well, he may well have thought that time passes. Price quotes Ramsey as saying, in a sense, my action is an ultimate and the only ultimate contingency. So not for Ramsey, the perspective of the universe when thinking about his own action. Yet it's the perspective of the universe that Ramsey appears to take when he discusses time. He begins with physics and he arrives at a view of events as having temporal parts in their own right and as being temporal parts of substances. I mean, even nowadays, many people will like a view like Ramsey's, but I'm only suggesting that it fits ill with various other things he was apt to say. So I don't myself believe that a relation between events in the sense in which Ramsey gives an account of events could assist us in giving an account of action, nor therefore could it belong in the sought after Ramseyan pragmatism. So what should I conclude? And I'm getting to the end. I think one can't think about action in realistic spirit if one starts from the concepts of physics. I think the attractions of foundationalism connect with, which Simon suggested Ramsey didn't find attractive. They actually connect in people's minds with the attractions of thinking physics first. I mean, they're quite different views, of course, but so I think Ramsey's thought about causation was at odds with his wanting to do philosophy in realistic spirit. But the second thing, I think, is that the pragmatism which is needed in order to complete Ramsey's account of truth will never be forthcoming. That's what I've been making points towards arguing. So I think that Ramsey really did think him in realistic spirit. I'm happy to enlist him with the pragmatists, as it were. I think it was only when he turned to the metaphysics of events and substances and tried to think about how action comes about in terms of events that he departed from his own realism. So I understand why he should have thought that Peirce got many things right. But another thing I think is that Ramsey was actually right to think that an account of truth must aspire to be one which makes no use of the concept of truth. And that means that if a Ramseyan pragmatism of the kind I've been arguing is impossible, if that sort of Ramseyan pragmatism is not to be got, then we must say that truth is indefinable, because we were going to, as it were, introduce this pragmatism in order to have a complete account of truth. So if we seek the nature of truth, that's not going to be found in any definition. But I think truth, like many of our concepts, we understand perfectly well, even if we can't define it. And that leads me to say something about the value of truth, since I tried to start the paper on the nature of truth, and I'm going to end with the value of truth. So myself, I'd say that the value of truth is the value of the lives of such human beings who have right beliefs and right desires. And here I'm inspired by Ramsey. I think when many people think about truth and its value, they think in a sort of intellectual spirit. They think about thought as valuable insofar as it's true. And then they confine themselves to beliefs. But I think the kind of pragmatism which Ramsey favoured requires us to think about what we do as well as what we think when we consider what we value.
Thank you very much, Jen. So I'm now going to turn everything over to Cheryl.
Great. Well, first off, let me thank my two really superb commentators slash critics. It's just such a pleasure and privilege to have people like Simon Blackburn and Jen Hornsby turn their attention to your material. So thank you very much. Lots of great food for thought. I'm going to start off with a response to Simon, then move to Jen, and then bring it all together at the end. So just Simon, just a few historical niceties at the beginning that come about because of some questions you raised. So Newman's paper was read to the Moral Sciences Club in December 1927. And unlike when you were editor of Mind, the way it worked back then was that Moore in the audience, if he really liked the paper, he just went up to the speaker afterwards and said, "Can I have that for Mind?" And I would bet that that's exactly what happened there. Moore just snapped it up. So there wasn't this period where Newman had submitted it and it had to be refereed. Didn't work like that in those days. Now, as to the question about who was the first to use the term Ramsification for what you rightly say was an idea that Russell already had. I'm going to see if Bernie Linsky, who's here and who's one of the great Russell scholars ever, might know actually if Russell was the first to use ramification. Wouldn't surprise me. So what I'm going to argue in my response is that Ramsey sentences are more than Ramsification, and they're more interesting. So I agree with you. It would really be strange if Ramsey had been drawn into the sparsely mathematical landscape of the program of Russell, Schlick, and Carnap. And I'm going to show that he wasn't drawn into it. As you point out, Ramsey was heavily influenced by Peirce, who thought, and this is passage 1 on your handout, there is but one state of mind from which you can set out, namely the very state of mind in which you actually find yourself at the time you do set out, a state in which you were laden with an immense mass of cognition already formed, of which you could not divest yourself if you would. Now, as usual, it's really hard to tell what's going on in Ramsey's texts. He was thinking hard about scientific theories throughout the late 1920s and writing snippets about the problem until his death in January 1930. And I don't actually think he had come to a settled view of the matter. And it was going to go into the book. So Ramsey started the famous paper, Theories, which we don't know really when was written, and I agree with you that it would be very strange if he hadn't mentioned Newman in writing it. So my guess is that it was probably written around 1927, December, when he and Newman were probably talking about this thing that they had seen in Russell. So Ramsey started the paper as follows: "Let us try to describe a theory simply as a language for discussing the facts the theory is said to explain." Now notice the completely uncommitted, let us try to think of the theory in this way. He then argued that when we try, we can indeed construct a theory out of simple observational facts using the set of axioms in the dictionary that translates the primary language into the secondary language. That is, he showed how we might do this. But the problem wasn't Ramsey's. He was showing how we might do this for his friends. He said that we have to do this because Russell and Carnap and a few others seem to think that we can and we must do it. So he was literally just kind of lending a hand to his friends in what I think was just a set of notes. But he thought the project wouldn't work. One obstacle, perhaps surmountable, is that it would be really complicated, and he talks about there needing to be a primary language that contained a set of experiences and time order and a structure for colors and smells. So he's thinking about Carnap there. It's going to be really complicated, Carnap. The really insurmountable obstacle, though, he thought, is that the arbitrariness of the definitions makes it impossible for them to be adequate to the theory as something in the process of growth. These are number 3 on your handout. Also, if we proceed by explicit definition, we cannot add to our theory without changing the definitions, and so the meaning of the whole. And this would be a disaster for reasons we're now all familiar with, in that we need to be able to explain how a concept like mass evolves and yet retains its original meaning. And on the explicit definition account of scientific theories, it just looks like every time the theory changes, the definition of mass changes. So Ramsey thought, and this is number 4 in your handout, that all useful theories must have more degrees of freedom than the primary system. The dictionary alone does not suffice. And he thinks that there'd be no point in having a theory or a secondary system unless it went beyond the facts, beyond a catalog of the facts. He also asserted that the definitions are not necessary for the legitimate use of the theory. It is merely instructive to show how they could be set out. And again, that instruction was just to show Russell and Carnap, yeah, this is how you do it. But as you point out, Russell had already been on to this idea. Also, Wittgenstein's Tractatus clearly shared something with these projects. So the problem wasn't Ramsey's. He wasn't interested in that foundationalist project. And if that kind of reading of theories doesn't convince you of it, let's just look to see what Ramsey says about these projects, Russell's, Carnap's, Wittgenstein's, in some other papers and notes. So here's what he said in the 1929 paper, Philosophy, where he was setting out his approach against the approach of those others. And this is number 6 on your handout. He says, the chief danger to our philosophy, apart from laziness and woolliness, is scholasticism, the essence of which is treating what is vague as if it were precise and trying to fit it into an exact logical category. That was a jab at Wittgenstein. About Carnap, he said, and this is number 7 on your list, any attempt to analyze this patch is red into a theoretical construction of an infinite class of points on a visual field would be giving up philosophy for theoretical psychology. So Carnap and Wittgenstein, Ramsey said, make a mistake because it's the subject, because the subject or the perceiver isn't in their picture. As you so nicely said, their picture is just structure. And in one of the very few notes of Ramsey's where he mentions Carnap, he read Carnap, but he was very kind of wary of mentioning him. And in fact, on his deathbed, he was apologizing to Schlick for being late with that review of Carnap. And it was a review of the Aufbau, clearly been published in 1928. So here's one of Ramsey's very few notes on Carnap. Solipsism in the ordinary sense, in which, as an example, Carnap, the primary world consists of my experiences past, present, and future, will not do. For this primary world is the world about which I am now thinking. And he was even harsher about Schlick, who he really liked. He had met Schlick a number of times. Unlike Carnap, he never met him. He said of Schlick, he didn't seem to me much of a philosopher, but a very nice man. Okay, so that's the negative part of Ramsey's ideas of these foundational theories. Obviously, he didn't like them. So if it's possible, but not necessary to think of a scientific theory in terms of explicit definition, then how should we think of theories? How is it best to think of theories? Well, Ramsey's answer in what gets called the paper theories is the following, and it's number 10 on your list. Clearly, judgment is involved. And as we've heard from Jen, Ramsey was long occupied with the problem of judgment or belief, and he characterized it as a habit of action, which can be assessed in terms of whether or not it's successful. So Ramsey instructs Carnap, Russell, and the others not to think of the theory as just the set of definitions and axioms, but to think of it as a growing existentially quantified judgment, which will meet the future successfully or not. And in that existentially quantified judgment, we commit ourselves to the existence of all the entities in our theory, knowing that if the theory gets overthrown, so will our commitment to those entities. And in the meantime, we use the theory and we believe it to be true because it's our best theory. So in addition to the, so we revise the theory and we account for growth, and the theory can evolve while still being about the original entities. And here's something that Ramsey says about definitions, again in that paper, Philosophy. This is number 11 on your list. Definitions are to give at least our future meaning and not merely to give any pretty way of obtaining a certain structure. So Ramsey's account of a robust definition is it will tell us how to go on using a term by making it more precise and making the vague thing that it stands for more precise. We're to treat our theory of the world as an evolving existential statement, and it of course is going to be one that starts from where we are in the history of our inquiry. So in theories, he says, just as the storyteller says, once upon a time there was a girl who, and then tells a story about the girl, in telling a story about electrons, we say, there exists some things and they're electrons, and then we fill in the picture for our theory. But unlike the bedtime story, where we don't believe that there was a girl who, in our scientific theory, we believe the theory about electrons, we commit ourselves to it until we're given reason, if we are, to abandon it. So Simon, I think you're just exactly right. Ramsey would have had no truck with that sparse landscape. I think he saw Newman's problem very clearly. He may well have seen that Russell had seen the problem. He probably thought that Newman's paper was a very nice statement of it. Didn't mention it because, he thought it was one of 25 problems with this foundationalist theory of Russell and Carnap's. So Ramsey's a pragmatist in this context here. He was after what he called a realistic approach. Sometimes he called it a naturalistic approach. And when I turn to Jen's commentary, we'll see that come up again. And just to end with another couple of passages that I think make it pretty clear that Ramsey was alert to Newman's problem. He says the following in the paper that gets called General Propositions and Causality. I keep saying the paper that gets called because Braithwaite titled it. These were untitled notes of Ramsey's. Again, notes that I think were intended eventually for the book. So here's what he says in General Propositions and Causality. If two systems both fit the facts, is the choice not capricious? We do, however, believe that the system is uniquely determined and that long enough investigation will lead us all to it. This is Peirce's notion of truth as what everyone will believe in the end. It does not apply to the truthful statement of matters of fact, but the true scientific system. So Peirce's theory of truth as our best system of belief doesn't apply to those statements in the primary language that Wittgenstein and Carnap and Russell were so interested in, but rather it applies to our growing existential theory of the world. So Ramsey's argument, I think, is quite similar to Arthur Fine's natural ontological attitude. We accept what's in our best theories. It's also similar to the pragmatist solution to the problem of induction, which you were concerned with as a graduate student. The reason we're justified in believing that all emeralds are green rather than grue despite the fact that they have equal inductive support, so you could see them as two theories that we have to choose from, is that the green hypothesis grew up, as it were, in inquiry, and hence it has a kind of abductive weight that the GRU hypothesis just doesn't have. So the choice is easy. We don't have structural similarity, and we're not at C. So I hope I've made it clear that when Ramsey says that the arbitrariness of the definitions that he finds in Russell and Carnap can't account for growth, this is an indication that he was alert to Newman's problem. And again, of course he was. He was probably at that moral sciences session. Unfortunately, the Moral Sciences Club, unlike the Apostles, doesn't have a list of who was there. It doesn't give an account of, or at least it didn't then, of who asked what questions. But he was a regular reader of Mind, a very close friend of Newman's, was running into him in the street all the time, and you bet they were all talking about this problem that was fatal to the Russell-Carnap foundationalism, or gets called structural realism now. Okay, that was a whirlwind response to Simon. Now to Jen. So what I'm going to argue here is that Ramsey mustn't and really can't be read as an extreme pragmatist of the kind that Jen just completely rightly objects to. Ramsey's shtick in the book manuscript was he was going to take the best insight from pragmatism and the best insight from the correspondence theorist and come up with what, when push came to shove, he called his own naturalist position. And because he was pulling insights from these two very different traditions, I think that's why it looks like he was at odds with himself at times. And this is what Jen was suggesting in the final section of her paper. And the big question for Ramsey and for any kind of what Ramsey called non-ludicrous pragmatism is whether the pragmatist is at such odds in these ways with herself, or whether there is a way of being a pragmatist who takes seriously that the world is a certain way, because Ramsey certainly did, and I do, and C.I. Lewis did, David Wiggins does. These are the kind of pragmatists, and Peirce does as well, who want to retain an account of, or retain some objectivity in their pragmatism. So I'm really going to try to show that Ramsey wouldn't disagree with much of what Jen says, and I think he even wouldn't disagree that truth is indefinable, because remember what he thinks of definition. The kind of definition that everyone was on about in the 1920s was what Russell called analytic definition, and more breaking something down to its ultimate simples and providing necessary and sufficient conditions for the thing to be defined. Ramsey's account of definition is to show how we should use the term in the future. So in the traditional sense of definition, Ramsey would, I think, say that truth is not definable in that sense. And I think he also really would agree with what Jen says, that the value of truth lies in what we do, not in our beliefs having some property like truth. Okay, so as Jen so nicely notes, Ramsey, from his undergraduate days till his very last days, always mentioned something that seems like the redundancy theory when he talked about truth. And Jen has shown us what it looked like when he was an undergraduate in 1921. And in the 1929 book manuscript, I think that the gloss that Jen and Ian Rumfitt give is exactly right. And this is number 1 on your handout. X believes something true if and only if there's a way X believes things to be, and they are that way. X believes something false if and only if there's a way X believes them to be, and they aren't that way. That's pretty vague, and it's not at all like the kinds of correspondence theories that were thick on the ground in Ramsey's day. It wasn't like Russell's theory in the 1918, the philosophy of logical atomism. Russell called his position there an analytic realism, in which you, this is a quote, you can get down in theory, if not in practice, to ultimate simples out of which the world is built, and those simples have a kind of reality not belonging to anything else. A proposition is true if it stands in the corresponding relation with the objects it picks out. That's Russell, 1918. The young undergraduate Ramsey in 1921 is going to be thinking about that when he thinks about the correspondence theory. As Braithwaite, I have Braithwaite on a tape saying, we were word perfect on Russell. And that's word perfect on the 1918 Russell, on the 1920 Russell, and 1922 Russell. As Russell changed his mind, they were all word perfect. But of course, the very next year, 1922, Ramsey had a different correspondence theory in mind, because 1922 is the year that he was asked to translate Wittgenstein's Tractatus. And now, and you can see this happening in his work, he shifts from Russell's correspondence theory to Wittgenstein's correspondence theory in the Tractatus. So that's the kind of theory that Ramsey had in mind when he made those arguments that Jen put so nicely against the correspondence theory. Now, Jen asks what might be claimed by a more sophisticated correspondence theory, by a more sophisticated theory worthy of the name correspondence theory. But Ramsey wanted something, if you like, less sophisticated. He didn't want that very complex Tractarian view view of Russell's, where you break down a sentence and show how each part of it corresponds to something in the world. For it's the attempt at precision that is absolutely deadly to the correspondence theory. So in 1929, Ramsey says this, and it's number 2 in your handout. I used to worry myself about the nature of philosophy through excessive scholasticism. I could not see how we could understand a word and not be able to recognize whether a proposed definition of it was or was not correct. I did not realize the vagueness of the whole idea of understanding, the reference it involves to a multitude of performances, any of which may fail and require to be restored. So if that's not making you think of the later Wittgenstein, just go back and read it later. And as anyone who's read the biography knows, one of my claims is that Ramsey was responsible for getting Wittgenstein to abandon the view in the Tractatus and become the later Wittgenstein, although Ramsey wouldn't have liked what Wittgenstein did with his pragmatism. Ramsey also thought that the purity involved in Wittgenstein's project damned it. So this is number 3 on your list. We cannot really picture the world as disconnected selves. The selves we know are in the world. What we can't do, and it's no good trying. Philosophy comes from not understanding the logic of our language. But the logic of our language is not what Wittgenstein thought. The pictures we make to ourselves are not pictures of facts. So that's, I think, one of my favorite passages from Ramsey. The pictures we make to ourselves are not pictures of facts. But notice that facts there means the kind of facts you find in the Tractatus or in Russell's logical atomism. Jen just very nicely showed how Ramsey was dead set against that conception of facts. But he wasn't dead set against any conception of fact, a more vague conception of fact. And as Jen noted, Ramsey thought that the correspondence theory had to be brought on board in this vague sense. He says, like pragmatism, correspondence is not simply to be mocked. He put the point differently in different drafts, but the sentiment was always the same. And this is number 4 on your list. Sure, a true belief is one that corresponds to the facts, but we can't specify what that means any further than to say that correspondence is the type or types, since it may be different with different forms of belief, of relation between thinking that such and such is the case and such actually being the case. So this is what correspondence is for Ramsey. And all of you who were at the Flickering Shadows session will recognize this as Ramsey's way of saying the concept of truth has to be unified, but it applies to a diversity of different kinds of beliefs, empirical beliefs, moral beliefs, mathematical beliefs, and on conditionals. So again, correspondence is the type of relation between thinking that such and such is the case and such is actually being the case. And that can look very different for different kinds of beliefs. So Jen also notes that the transition Ramsey always made from that equivalence definition of truth to the more substantial notion of content was what he thought was really important, that it was the notion of the content of belief that was going to do the heavy lifting. And unfortunately, we don't have a definitive statement of Ramsey's on just what kind of pragmatism he was appealing to when he fleshed out the content of belief, but he does give us quite a few examples. The worst is the chicken example, for the reasons that Jen mentions. But here's another one from the 1929 General Propositions and Causality. And this is number 5 on your handout. Suppose the human race, for no reason, always supposed strawberries would give them stomachache, and so never ate them. Then all their beliefs, strictly so-called, example, if I eat strawberries, I shall have a pain, would be true. But would there really not be something wrong? Is it not a fact that if they had eaten them, they wouldn't have had a pain? We only regard it as sense if it or its contradictory can be deduced from our system. But their system, you say, fitted all the facts known to them. If two systems both fit the facts, is the choice not capricious? We do, however, believe that the system is uniquely determined and that long enough investigation will lead us all to it. Again, this is Peirce's notion of truth as what everyone will believe in the end. It does not apply to the truthful statements of matter of fact, but the true scientific system. What was wrong with our friends, the strawberry abstainers, was that they did not experiment. So again, this takes us back to what I was saying about Simon. Ramsey thinks that we are situated in a context of inquiry, and we're trying to find the best system that fits all the facts. And one of the ways that we want to do that is to make our system responsive to all the facts. So you'd better experiment, as he says, to increase the weight of your probabilities. Otherwise, you're not going to get a system that will meet the future well. And then just finally, I just want to tell you what the example looks like in the book manuscript. So Ramsey says, to say a man believes in hell means, according to the pragmatists, that he avoids doing those things which would result in his being thrown into hell. That's the pragmatist theory of content, and that's fine as it stands, Ramsey thinks. What it is for me to believe in hell is that I go on the street and I proselytize and I behave in all sorts of ways that will keep me out of hell, given that I don't want to burn in it. So that's the pragmatist account of content. He continues, such conduct will be useful to the man if it really saves him from hell. But if there is no such place, it will be a mere waste of opportunities for enjoyment. So again, you have Ramsey saying, yes, what it is to believe something is to act in certain ways. But your actions will only be successful if they're responsive to the way things are. So this is the Ramsey move, and this is Ramsey's pragmatism. Okay, both Jen and Ian Rumfitt stress the need to recognize not just the action that's downstream from the belief, but also what's upstream from the belief. And Jen suggests that this is a problem for Ramsey's pragmatism, that it's all about action, I believe. As Jen puts it, the chicken's behavior is intelligible only if it recognizes the caterpillar to be of a certain sort. And she's rightly concerned about what is dragged into the account by the would-be Ramseyan pragmatists. And what's dragged into the account is belief desire psychology. Now, here is, as she mentioned, she's referring to Simon's work and what Simon says in the guest box of the biography, I think is an evolved position from your original account of success semantics, which you found in Ramsey, but we could more accurately identify the recently departed and very much missed Hugh Mellor as holding this position of success semantics, which argues that the contents of our beliefs are those that explain the success of the actions they cause. And that's the entirety of belief. And in a way, success semantics was designed to get rid of all that upstream stuff, recognition, intention. And Simon, I'll let you, if you like, when we open things up, give your current thoughts on success semantics. But for my part, let me say that Ramsey would never have signed up to this program. He would agree completely with Jen. All along in the 1921 paper on propositions, in the 1926 facts and propositions, in the book manuscript, in like all along, Ramsey characterized belief not merely as a disposition or habit to act, but also as what he called a mental state. And this is number 8 on your list. Belief is a mental state with different aspects or characters, each of which is of great importance. The first consists of a psychological factor, such as the presence or absence of feelings. Other characters are its propositional reference or content, as Jen says, and it's being a habit. So Ramsey just wasn't a behaviorist who thought that mental states are identical to physical or behavioral states. He just thought that if you focus on the mental state aspect of belief, you're just not going to get very far in your philosophical theory. Much better to focus on belief as being a habit, because then you can talk about theories as being our best system of belief. You can talk about how to assess beliefs in terms of whether they meet the future well or not. And this is just this is the way to do philosophy, not through introspection, not by focusing on the mental aspect of belief, not by trying to get rid of the mental aspect of belief the way that Wittgenstein and Carnap do, so that they end up being solipsis, the self is out of the picture, as it were. So this is Ramsey's sort of great attempt at having a position that incorporated both what he sometimes called the subjective side and the objective side. So our beliefs are the things that are true or false. They're habits of action assessed in terms of whether they meet the future successfully or not. Okay, let's just wrap up with a thought again about that system of beliefs, that Peircean system of beliefs. So he says that beliefs can express cognitive attitudes without being part of the primary language. Our beliefs, this is number 11 on your handout, our beliefs form the system with which the speaker meets the future. They are not, therefore, subjective in the sense that if you and I enunciate different ones, we are each saying something about ourselves which pass by one another, like, I went to Grantchester, and Simon says, I didn't. So these beliefs are entirely subjective because they rest on indexicals. Simon says, I went to Grantchester because he can, he's in Cambridge. I did not go to Grantchester today because I'm in Toronto. We don't disagree when Simon says, I went to Grantchester, and Cheryl says, I didn't. But if you and I meet the future with different systems, then, Ramsey says, we disagree. We assume that the system, or sorry, we assume that the future will be compatible with one of our systems, but not the other. And here again, we find something objective. We find what Hugh Price has so nicely argued, that truth is the grit that makes our disagreements engage as opposed to slide past each other as they do in the Grantchester case. So again, I hope I've given just some flavor of how Ramsey wanted to combine what he saw as what was good in pragmatism with what was good in the correspondence theory without becoming a correspondence theorist or a pragmatist. Let's just call him a naturalist, although that term is freighted with other meanings these days. But he really is, I think, in the lineage which goes from C.S. Peirce to C.I. Lewis, and now these days to people like David Wiggins and myself, who want to focus on both the subjective and objective parts of truth. Now I'll end there. Thank you.